Hello everyone, it's great to have you on board with us today for this webinar and discussion about live weight and its relationship to scanning and reproduction and some of the findings that we've had from this PDS. I am Millie Shields from the Department of Primary Industries in Queensland, and today I'm joined by Dr Gordon Refshauge from New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, and Rhonda Toms-Morgan in the background for us from Connect Ag. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Making Maidens Weight producer demonstration site, also known as a PDS, which is funded by Meat Livestock Australia and is supported by the Grazing Futures Livestock Business Resilience Project. So you may have noticed that today I've given you access to your microphones, and it looks like everyone's got theirs turned off, which is fantastic. So yeah, please keep yourselves on mute for the entirety of the presentation, and you'll get the chance to ask your questions in the Q&A time at the end of the presentation. Or there's also the chat box or the Q&A box where you can write your questions, which we'll get to a little bit later on. So today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Leading Sheep website, which is where you can find out more about this project. And once the recording is available, you'll also receive a link to the recording in your emails. And at the end of the discussion today, I'll pop up a link to a feedback form. We would really appreciate it if you could take 2 minutes of your time to answer the few questions. This will help us demonstrate the value and usefulness of the activities that we run, which might offer up additional opportunities down the track, which can be driven by what you're interested in. So thank you in advance for that. And now I would like to hand over to Gordon. Many of you will be familiar with Dr Gordon Refshauge, who's a senior research scientist in the field of maternal efficiency. Gordon's our subject matter expert for this PDS, and through his work with the group has become quite familiar with the production system in Western Queensland and some of the challenges that impact husbandry and reproduction in the region. So today he's pulled together some data generated by the demonstration properties with a primary focus on the Beaconsfield flock for today, and he'll discuss some of the trends and interesting findings from the project. So over to you, Gordon.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks very much, Millie. So for everybody, I have a cold and today is the worst day of it. I woke up this morning like I'd been eating sandpaper. So you have to just bear with me. I haven't spoken for 24 hours. I'm trying to protect my voice. But if I have a coughing fit or splutter and carry on, I'll do my best. Okay, so I'll start my presentation, which is about making maidens weight. And the subtitle of my presentation today is Data, Tada, which is a really nice little title because once you start to collect data and then pull it together, the messages start to reveal themselves, which is really the point of what we're trying to do in terms of achieving higher pregnancy rates in maidens and when we're starting to look at reproduction outcomes in sheep, which is really important because reproduction's a key driver of profit in sheep farming systems. Oh, you're going to do that, are you? Okay, right. So most important thing is to remember that you can't manage what you're not measuring. It's an important thing to just keep in mind because that's quite simply really the case. If you're not making any attempt to keep track of what you're trying to do when you're trying to improve things, and it's really hard to at least get there in the end or get there quickly and efficiently. What I'm going to cover in this presentation is an update, in particular focusing on the Beaconsfield data. That's principally because the messages are fairly consistent between the two sites, and the Beaconsfield data, without me having to jump across between two flocks and explain the background, the nuances, I'll just focus on the one flock and explain the stories. But I'll also just touch on some new work that I've been doing with the maiden reproduction data at Cowra, which is the research flock here at the research station. And then I'll also touch on flock structure models. So I'm often asked questions about culling first time fail to rear ewes or culling first time fail to get pregnant? And my answer is always, it depends on how many and what percentage. So I've got a little model that I've developed in Excel, and I'll just discuss that a little bit as well. So straight into the Beaconsfield data. This is me and Peter it's a couple of years ago. David Council took that photo. It's a really lovely landscape there. So thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to work in Central Queensland. I've really enjoyed it. So what we've been doing is capturing live weight at the time of mating, around the time of mating or before mating, for 3 drops of maiden ewes. And those ewes were born in 2021, yellow tags, the red tags in 22, and the blue tags in 2023. You can see here, this is a live weight distribution. I believe my mouse will come up on the screen. So this is the number of animals. It's a histogram. So this is just the count of animals in each of these weight classes, running from 20 kilograms nearly through to well over 70 kilograms in live weight. You can see that the yellow tags were the heaviest group, followed by the red tags and then the blue tags. And this graph's really important because all 3 groups overlap in the 40 to 50 kilogram range, and that's really valuable for us because it means that we can make some comparisons between each of the years with confidence. So you can see the 3 different groups of maidens weighed different, had different weights over each of the different joining periods. Because they have different live weights at joining, they also generally had different reproduction outcomes. So the yellow tag ewes were the heaviest. They had a good pregnancy rate. They had the highest twinning rate, and of course that leads to the highest scanning rate at 116%. When we follow those ewes that were pregnant through to their rearing status, only 55% of those ewes were wet at marking. That's quite an important number, and I'll come back to this a couple of times through the presentation. The red tags weren't quite as heavy, similar pregnancy rate, not as many twins, not as high a scanning rate, and a similar fail to rear or rearing rate success in the pregnant ewes, back in the 50% again. Blue tag maidens were the lightest. They had the lowest pregnancy rate, which goes hand in glove with lower live weights at mating. Because the live weight was low and the pregnancy rates are low, of course, the twinning rate's going to be low. You just don't have the ovulation rate when you have low pregnancy rates and low live weight. Fetuses scanned is also lower because of the low pregnancy rate and the low twinning rate. But the seasonal conditions were different for the blue tag ewes. They were delayed in their mating and they landed on some better feed, and their rearing success per pregnant ewe was higher. So we have 2 stories here. One is higher weights, higher scanning rates, higher pregnancy rates, and then the lambing in a difficult season lowers our rearing success. Whereas if we're joining in a difficult season, we have lower pregnancy rates. But if we're lambing in a slightly more favourable condition, we're getting slightly better rearing rates per pregnant ewe. This graphic needs a bit to describe. It's the 3 drops, yellow tags, red tags, and blue tags. It is the proportion of ewes that are pregnant. The dots at the top here are the pregnant ewes. They are blue or they are red or they are yellow, reflecting the weight of those ewes that were pregnant for each of these drops as maidens. And the bottom of the graph here, the points are at 0, which means they are not pregnant ewes, blue tags, red tags, and yellow tags. There's really one thing you can tell out of this graphic is that the lines are fairly similar as live weight increases. So for heavier animals, the fertility rate is higher. So more ewes are getting pregnant if they are heavier than if they are lighter. And there's not a large amount of difference between the red tags, between the blue tags and the yellow tags. So reasonably consistent result. Because we know that the blue tags were lighter, they are at the lighter end of the weight range, and so they have this lower curve, but the curve is on a fairly similar trajectory as with the heaviest ewes that were the yellow tags. So fertility is reasonably predictable. There's a little difference in the red tags. It's quite possible due to some of them being fed if they were lighter. Next graphic is twinning rate. So this is of those ewes that are pregnant, how many are carrying twins and what relationship does that have with live weight? So again, on the horizontal axis, we have pre-mating live weight, and as live weight increases, we get non-linear increases in twinning rate. So the proportion of ewes that are pregnant having twins starts to increase quite quickly after about 45 kilograms. Again, the yellow tags with the heaviest ewes, they have a slightly different curve, but still increasing as ewes get heavier. But the blue tags and the red tags this time have a fairly similar curve, which is reasonably predictable. It's actually quite neat. This next graphic combines the two. Pregnancy rate and twinning rate gives us scanning rate. How many fetuses are present per ewe scanned, and what relationship does that have with live weight? And this pulls all those lines together. And this is really the neatest data that I've seen on these relationships. All three drops have really quite a predictable outcome for their scanning rate. Number of fetuses present per ewe scanned increases as live weight increases, and you get a fairly consistent result no matter what the year drop. You can tell, so there's 3 dots on the line here. So there's the non-pregnant ewes are on the bottom. The middle series of points are the singles, and the top series of points are the multiples, the twins. And you can see that these ewes start heavier. Even the lightest of the blue tags are heavier when they're having twins. Geez, I hope my voice is going to hold on. So having got them pregnant, we also want to know what relationship pre-mating live weight has with the ability of those ewes to rear. You remember from the first table that I showed where we had high pregnancy rate scanning rates in the yellow and red tags, which was lower in the blue tags, but the blue tags had a higher rearing rate. And so this graphic shows that relationship, shows that detail around the relationship with pre-mating live weight. The reds and the yellows, when they land in more difficult conditions, had a very similar relationship, whereas the blue tags were rearing more lambs, perhaps slightly more favourable. And Peter, I think, is online, can provide some commentary in the chat or answer some questions on this, but shows a higher rearing success. Principally, okay, so the graphic shows the proportion of ewes that are rearing at least one lamb of the pregnant ewes. So if they were pregnant and not rearing, they're the 0 points on the bottom. And if they were pregnant and rearing, they're at the top. So a twin-bearing ewe that has 2 fetuses is much more likely to rear a lamb. And of course, a single-bearing ewe that fails to rear is obviously a dry ewe. So there's some differences there that tend to favour twin-bearing ewes, just because the probabilities of rearing at least one of those is slightly higher for twins. And of course, as live weight's increasing, the rearing success is increasing. This doesn't necessarily mean lamb survival is different, but the probability of these ewes rearing at least one lamb increases as they are heavier. Now, the yellow tags drop out of this data at this point because they were out of scope for the project. We weren't really focusing on the yellow tags. The project's been around the reds and the blues, but we carried the yellow data as we started to work on there just to iron out a few issues, and I've carried that data forward, but they weren't weighed at the start of joining in 2024 for their 3rd mating at Beaconsfield. So here I just have the red tag ewes, which were joined as maidens and either were rearing a lamb or not rearing a lamb. And the not rearing group includes those ewes that weren't pregnant. So here, this graphic has 2 lines in it. They are the wet ewes that are rearing a lamb or the non-rearing dry ewes in the red line. So the top line is the wet ewes and the lower line is the dry ewes. And this graphic shows the proportion. It's a predicted probability. It's a fitted model to the data now. It's the predicted probability of fertility. That graph starts at 50%, it goes to 100%. So if that graph started at 0, those lines would be flatter. But at 50%, it shows that we've got actually still quite a sharp and sudden increase in fertility between the two groups as live weight increases at their second mating. And if those ewes were wet last year, their fertility rate is already higher. Gaps are larger in lighter weight animals and they narrow in the heavier weight animals. But what it really shows is that, for example, a 50 kilogram ewe, if she didn't rear a lamb last year, this year was more likely, about 70% likely to have a lamb, be pregnant, whereas the ewe that reared a lamb last year, who was also 50 kilograms, had a probability of being pregnant of 85%. So rearing success has a bearing on the following reproduction outcome. If we follow those ewes through this year to whether they reared a lamb this year or not, we have this graphic which shows dry or wet ewes last year. The wet ewes are at the top line and last year's dry ewes are the lower line. Again, we have the live weight at mating on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical we have the predicted probability of rearing at least one lamb. So if those ewes were rearing a lamb last year, live weight wasn't terribly sensitive for its role in their ability to rear a lamb this year, but live weight was much more sensitive if they hadn't reared a lamb last year. And you can see quite clearly stark differences in the predicted probability of these ewes rearing a lamb at 50 kilograms. Those ewes not rearing a lamb last year that were 50 kilos at mating this year, who then got pregnant, had a 65% chance of rearing this year, whereas if they had reared last year and were 50 kilograms and pregnant this year, they were more like 95% likely to rear a lamb. So keeping track of wet and dry ewes is important. The question is, can we afford to turf them out the first time they fail? So this is the ewes as maidens in their maiden year. Pregnancy rates, how many are rearing, and how many are not rearing any lambs at all over the whole year as maidens. And I'll walk you through it. So the yellow tag ewes had an 83% pregnancy rate. That means 17% of them were not pregnant. Of those ewes that were pregnant, 55% were rearing, which means 45% of the pregnant ewes were not rearing. So you have to bear with me on the maths here, because 45% of 83% is 37%. And 37% of those ewes that were pregnant and didn't rear, plus the ewes that didn't get pregnant, is 37 plus 17 is 54%. So in the maidens, yellow tag maidens, 54% of those ewes didn't rear a lamb in their first year, whether they got pregnant or not. The red tags, similar successful pregnancy rates, similar difficulty at rearing, and again, 58% were not rearing a lamb in their first year. The blue tags, lower pregnancy rate, much higher rearing rate success, but we're still pushing 50%, not rearing a lamb in their first year of reproduction. Now, if you were to cull first time fail, on these principles, you would turf out 50 to nearly 60% of your maidens. That's not sustainable. So let's look at what happens to these ewes over time, and we'll talk about the yellow tag ewes here, 2021 drop, and we follow whether they got pregnant in 2023 as a maiden and whether they got pregnant in 2024 and then what happened in 2025. So they were either not pregnant in 2023 or they were, and they weren't pregnant in 2024 or they were, and how many ewes there are and what happens next. So only 3 ewes were carried through to mating and pregnancy scanning in 2025 if they hadn't joined in the previous 2 years. And I suspect these 3 ewes know how to hide from Peter when he's mustering. They weren't pregnant and probably permanently infertile. If they weren't pregnant in the first year as maidens, were pregnant in the second year, the fertility this year was 42%. If they were pregnant and as a maiden, not pregnant last year, their fertility was 23% this year, quite low. But the majority of the ewes, where we have pregnant in both of those years, our fertility is the highest, although it was quite low this year for this group. You'll see that the twinning rate generally increases. Those ewes that are getting pregnant each year have a higher twinning rate, they have a higher scanning rate this year, and they also had a higher rearing rate this year. So these animals that get pregnant each year are the ones that are contributing to the business. So there's a non-random relationship here around fertility and the ability to breed. We follow the red tags. So they had their one mating as a maiden, what was their outcome, and what happened in terms of 2025's reproduction for each of those outcomes last year as maidens. So the red tags that were maidens, red tag maidens last year that were empty, not pregnant, 54% fertility this year. If they were bearing a single last year, to 78% fertility rate. And if they were carrying twins last year, it's a slightly higher increase in fertility. Not really very different, slightly higher. But the scanning rate was higher. And the number of ewes that were rearing each time also increased. So the empties as a maiden had a lower rearing rate this year when compared to ewes that were bearing twins last year. And of course, the ewes that are not pregnant and not rearing decreases. So this says ewes that are getting pregnant and having twins have some inherent improved fertility under the same conditions. I'm going to break away from the Beaconsfield flock for a second and just look at condition score relationships at Dunblane. This is David Council's data. David condition scored his ewes on their second mating and for the yellow tags on their third mating. And this graphic is quite neat because it shows there's differences between years, but generally the trend is that ewes that are in a higher body condition state at the start of mating will have, at weaning, this is weaning relationships, and their subsequent pregnancy rates, the fertility at the next mating. The red tags are on the lower graph, the second mating, and in the third mating there's only one group, and both of those use the red tags, and the third mating yellow tags were mated in 2025. 2024-25, and the second mating for the yellow tags, of course, was their 2024 reproduction outcome. So you can see year differences here, but you can see the trend is that at weaning, those ewes that are carrying more condition will have a slightly higher pregnancy rate. So that says to me, it's important to manage ewes after marking or weaning, particularly after weaning, to make sure that those lean ewes can recover their body condition if you can do it cost effectively or on grass. So I need to summarise this. And the implication on a broader context, thinking about your business and even thinking about the sheep industry, lower weaning rates means, of course, there's lower surplus sales. And it also means there's lower rates of genetic gain. So what I've been thinking about is, what does this mean for how you apply a culling pressure when your fail to rear rates can be quite high and variable from year to year? Should you cull your first time dry, and of course any of those ewes that are not fit to join, and of course not fit to join ewes are lame, they have udder faults and are usually broken mouth and probably too old? Or to cull the twice dry, or and a dry here means either didn't get pregnant or didn't rear and have done that 2 years in their life. Plus look at that spelling mistake, plus the proportion not fit to join. So I've done a little bit of work on a flock structure model, and this is to examine what are the implications of a poor year's reproduction in a flock if we have low rates of reproduction, and what happens if we retain more maidens rather than culling the maidens heavier. So the idea of the flock structure model is that over a 7 or more year period, the flock structure is stable in terms of, I want to breed, if you were breeding, say, 1,000 ewes, that'd be 100%. You're breeding 1,000 ewes every year, it's 100%. So the flock structure needs to be stable when it reaches that 100% consistently over time. So the flock structure model stabilised after I apply certain rules around culling and mortality. I look at the age groups from 2 to 7. When reproduction rates are higher, you can afford to sell your 7-year-olds, so you can, because you have more replacements coming into the flock. In the model, I varied reproduction rates around maidens and adults because they are different, and I varied breeder mortality and weaner mortality as well. So I've changed classing rates for maidens and adults, and I've watched the impact of 1 year on other years in a flock, and then I've stabilised the model to make sure it's always stable where 100% of the breeders are used every year. This is an example of the data. Our age groups 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 down the side here. The total number of ewes in percentage, and the total here includes the 7-year-olds, and then the total without 7-year-olds. So I've targeted a model that doesn't run 7-year-olds in this example. After the first year, things have to stabilise. So in the second, third, through the 8th year, the numbers as percentages of the breeders in the flock are fairly stable. The way to read this graphic is, for example, in year 2, if we have ewes that are 40% of the ewe flock is maidens. In year 3, after you've culled, not pregnant, and maybe applied some other culling and mortality, then you might only end up with 26% of the whole flock being 3-year-olds. In year 2, there's 26% of the ewes are 3-year-olds, and of course in year 3, it's only 16%. So there's a gradual removal through mortality and through classing if you can, through culling dry ewes or far in the rear, and the proportion of ewes in these age groups declines. And of course you get an average age of the group. So this example has an average age of 3.2 years, not including the 7-year-olds. When you have to increase your ewe age and you start to decrease proportions of maidens, then your ewe age starts to increase. And of course, older ewes means your genetic gains slowing down a little. So this graphic's got a lot going on in it. And what I want you to get a sense for here is the trend, the relationship between what these lines are doing over the axes. So at the bottom of the graph, I've got the number of lambs weaned per ewe joined. So I've run from 60% weaning rates through to 160%. The 3 lines have different weaner mortality rates. In this model, I killed 5% of the ewes out of each age group each year. The top line here, which is blue, only 5% of the weaners died before coming in as potential replacements as hoggets. Whereas the lower line is the green line, 15% of those weaners were killed before they came into the business as breeders. The graphic on the vertical, so the vertical line is the number of breeders that are available for culling as a percentage of all the breeders. So when our reproduction rates are low, we can't afford to cull too many ewes. That's quite simply because you run out of sheep. And you probably, in a self-replacing flock, don't want to be buying in these animals all the time. So if we're weaning 60% consistently over time in a stabilised model where 100% of the breeders are there after 6-7 years, you can only really afford to cull between 5 and 7% of all the ewes that come in as replacements. If you were weaning closer to 100%, somewhere around here, you can afford to cull between 20 and maybe 24% of all the ewes that come into the flock. So when we have years where 40% of the ewes are either not pregnant or not rearing a lamb, at the top here, you can't really afford to cull them all, even if you're weaning 160%, and even if your ewe mortality is 5% and your weaner mortality is 5%. So culling first time fail is a decision that you have to make in the context of how many animals you have, what your stocking rate needs to be in the next 3 to 6 months, and how you can stabilise that program over time. Of course, the implications differ between meat breeds and merino breeds. Whereas merinos, of course, you can afford to run dry sheep because they'll cut you a fleece. Whereas, of course, in the non-wool breeds and in the meat breeds, it's an expensive operation to run a sheep through to shearing as a dry animal. So the take-home message here is when your weaning rates are higher, you can afford to cull more heavily. Lower reproduction rates means your flock is older on average, and that means your rates of genetic gain are slower. If you cull too few maidens, it means you have too many young animals untested where their reproduction rates are lower. And to stabilise your model by bringing a lot of maidens in, you have to cull a lot of adults. And those adults are generally proven, or at least are reproductive and they have a known reproductive status. And so that model, lots of maidens, not as many adults by proportion, means you have a lower reproduction rate, and it tends to destabilise the flock structure. So in flocks that also have a low reproduction rate, it's clear from the way I've worked this model is that one dreadful year destabilises the flock structure for many years in a self-replacing breeding program. And of course, low weaning rates obligate a culling rule, which is twice fail in a self-replacing flock. So I'm going to jump to some cowra data. And this is cowra. This is one of the lucent paddocks. You can see in here, this is a salt feeder. It's got a solar panel on it because we've got an RFID antenna sitting underneath that salt feeder. You can see the little box on the side here that collects the data. The data is sent to a base station through LoRaWAN, or we can take it straight off the base station. We're using this type of technology to understand the relationships between animals using lick feeders in different scenarios. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the maidens at cowra. So I've got about 7 years of maidens. We've had a new manager came into the operation a few years back and increased the number of animals we run. So there's about 300 maidens joined every year. And here I'm going to show you pre-mating live weights and the relationships with fertility, twinning rate, and the number and the net rearing rate. That's how many of these ewes that were joined are rearing at least one lamb. But it also has information around whether those ewes were born as a twin or as a single. So this graphic has two lines. This is fertility. It's a predicted model, it's a fitted model from the data. So it shows the predicted probability of being pregnant increases as the ewes are heavier. And there's differences between those ewes that were born as a single or as a multiple. Now I have multiple in there because 5% of these ewes are triplets, but the majority of the multiples are twins. So we can talk about this birth type being the difference between being born a single or being born a twin. You can see as you increase live weight, there's a consistent improvement in fertility, but there's always a difference between those that were born a single and born a multiple. If we roll that forward into looking at how many of those pregnant ewes had twins, again, we get this sudden lift in twinning rate as live weight increases, and those ewes that were born as a multiple are more likely to have a twin themselves. They certainly have a high twinning rate when compared to the singles. Our average ewe weight is about 60 kilos. Our maidens are joined very close to that weight because of the luxury of high rainfall and winter forage crops and summer lucerne. So 60 kilo ewes, a single, has a twinning rate of about 44%, and a 60 kilogram ewe that's born as a multiple or a twin has a twinning rate about 55%. It's about a 10% lift. When we think about the proportion of those that were pregnant that then went on to rear a lamb, and this is the net rearing rates, not just pregnant ewes, it's also whether they got pregnant or not. You can see that the ewes that are born as multiples are much more likely to be rearing at least one lamb in their first year of mating, and that improves as the live weight increases. Now, we don't want our maiden ewes heavier than about 70 kilograms, but there were a few that ran up to 90, 80s and 90s. So this is data sparse end of the graph. but our target live weight is around 55 to 60 kilograms, and we have clear differences in the likelihood of those ewes rearing a lamb or not. So it's clear for us that we have a useful target, and we don't want too many light, and don't really want too many heavy. So last couple of slides. Maidens that are heavier are much more likely to be pregnant and more likely to be rearing lambs, and that's evident across 3 different flocks. Reproduction does have genetic components, but it's largely a nutrition relationship. So when you're buying rams, we come into the ram buying season, hopefully the stud sources have ASBVs available, which is the sheep breeding values, and if available, look out for conception rate, CON, and ERA, which is ewe rearing ability. And you want those to be higher. And of course, the RFID era is now mandatory. It's upon us. Everybody has to be ear tag with electronic ear tags their lambs this year. And so that enables us to move into the tada era. Excuse me. And so now that you're using RFID, the opportunity is there for you to keep track of weight, recording the birth type, keep track of preg scan, and their udder status. And you can start to understand the relationships between pre-mating live weight and the future reproduction outcomes for your animals. But it also gives you a chance to cull ewes that have failed twice in their life, not once. Second last slide. Don't forget, if you want to improve it, you probably should measure it. And the keys to success around improving rates of genetic gain, for example, a willingness to engage in the technologies and the programs, trust that the data is useful and meaningful, and you have to upskill. Millie, that's my last slide. This has been a delightful project to work with, and I'm looking forward to having more ongoing conversations around the data that we have created. So thanks very much to the team, and I'll stop sharing now, Millie.
Thanks, Gordon. Surprised your voice held up. That sounded very difficult, but well done. So yeah, we'll just, before we wrap things up, we'll just open it up to a bit of a Q&A. You should have access to your microphones to be able to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask Gordon a question. I'm pretty sure we've got both David and Peter online, who are our demonstration properties. So if you'd like to ask a question, either unmute yourself or pop it in the chat box. It doesn't look like there's anything in there at the moment in terms of questions. So I just wonder, Peter, go for it.
Thanks, Millie. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay.
Got you there.
Thanks, Gordon, for that. I had a question. The data you put up about the repeatability of, remating and lamb rearing, etc. Towards the end of your presentation on Beaconsfield, how I do know there's differences between the seasons and whatnot within those yellows and reds and blues, but how is that sort of finding consistent with elsewhere in industry where similar work's been done? Like, are we not? Yeah, is this? That's what the question is. That consistent? Yeah.
Yeah, so the question really is that if ewes failed to rear last year, are they likely to fail to rear this year, or what's their pregnancy rate? Is their pregnancy rate going to be lower? And I think the trend is yes. There'll be examples under different levels of management that can overcome some of those inherent challenges for those animals. But by and large, I would expect the absolute differences to vary, but the trend to stay the same. Ewes that fail to rear are a little more likely to do so. And there can be a range of reasons for that. Firstly, for ewes infertile, because in the past, I've been involved in AI programs, and we've had ewes that didn't have ovaries, had metastasized diseases. You can have adhesions. There can be a whole bunch of problems in the uterine tract, and that can cause permanent infertility. Then you can have structural issues around the udder, for example. Ewes can have bottle teats. They can have mastitis and only have one half. They can lose their whole udder. And if those sorts of things aren't inspected, then the animal has an obligate non-rearing animal, whether they're joined and pregnant or not. So there's structural issues there that are permanent, what we call permanent environment of the animal. And then there's genetic components in there as well. And there's going to be plus other, which is standard, which is an error. But by and large, I'd expect a ewe that failed to rear to be slightly more likely to do so.
Cool. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you.
Great. We've got a question in the chat from Laura, who's asking, for shedding sheep, would you think the data/weight to be similar for your findings or similar to your findings?
Yeah, I reckon the answer is yes. And it'll be the same for cows. It'll be the same for goats, probably for mice, rats, rabbits. I reckon the relationship's going to hold generally because of the things that I've just mentioned. But what I don't have is any data from shedding sheep that might shed some light on this. Excuse the pun. So if you had any of this kind of information, and one of the things we've always been looking for in this PDS is to get more data from producers that weigh their animals with RFID tags or some identification that's unique, and map those relationships with scanning and marking udder status. But I think the simple answer there for you, Laura, is yes.
David, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Did you have a question?
No, Millie.
No worries. We've got another one in the chat. A big range in live weight joining. Is it likely that this will have any relationship to whether the ewe was reared as a twin or single?
A really good question. So in the data for Cowra, because that's the data that I have for animals that were born as a twin or a single, and so I'll talk about born as a twin or a single rather than reared, because rearing status can slightly overcome. So you have a ewe born as a twin, reared as a single will be slightly heavier, usually because the lactation status for the ewe is set up by its litter size instead. But our ewes that were born as a twin were lighter at weaning than those ewes that were born as singles. But by their hogget mating, so that's at 19 months to lamb as a 2-year-old, those twin-born ewes were heavier. So they gained more weight over the difference over the time frame between weaning and their mating as a 19-month-old animal. So our twin-born ewes gained weight faster and were heavier, and that will also support the likelihood of them being more pregnant, high pregnancy rates, high twinning rates, and high rearing rates.
Clint, you've got yourself unmuted. Did you have a question?
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Do you think an OptiWeigh would be of any value once you know your sort of like a standard reference weight when they first go in, and then look for those little bit of gains over that 5 or 6 week period?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it comes from a scientist perspective. I don't have an OptiWeigh. I'm not familiar with the data and its relationship with the whole mob. So sample number of animals frequenting the OptiWeigh will be important to the accuracy of its prediction. But I know David Council has one, and I'd love any insight from David, because anything that tells you that the animals are gaining weight and is a fair indication that they are will help you make these decisions easier.
Yep. I've got 1 or 2 other questions if you've got time, unless someone else wants to ask one.
Did you want David to comment on that OptiWeigh one before we move on?
Yeah, okay. And we'll go back to the question. Yep.
Yeah.
Over to you, David.
Yeah, I've just read OptiWeigh, and my observation is your data, your the sample size will be small, and you're going to need to move the Optiway around the paddock and have multiple waters to stop one ewe sitting on the Optiway all morning long while they all come in for a drink and getting a lot of measurements on one sheep. I think they're pretty good, but 1 or 2 kilos over 5 weeks more. I'm yet to have enough experience to see whether you've got the sensitivity there, let alone tracking individual animals with those slight weight changes. Would be my comment at this point in time.
Thanks, David. Back to you, Clint.
Yeah, my question, it's a little bit off topic, but if you say you're buying in first cross ewes, so essentially, what some people say, buying in other people's problems, but that's probably a bit unkind. But you're buying in first cross ewes. Say they've been a little bit underfed or under, the nutrition hasn't been there in that first 6 to 9 months. Does that have a bearing on that pelvic region? And can you sort of play catch up when you buy them? You say you're buying them at 8 or 9 or 10 months old, and then you've got to put on a lot of weight in a short period of time. But in that early development, how does that influence scanning rates at all, or being able to get in lamb, or is it just purely the mating weight?
It's such a good question, and there's a lot to it. And from our PDS, we don't really have all the data that could actually point to an answer on this, because we know that there were real challenges in and around growth rate of the blue tags and the black tags. And it'd be great to see what happens with the black tags. But of course, they've had different seasons, right? So they had a tough post-weaning, and then seasonal conditions have changed more favourably. In terms of how well grown a young animal is, there is a study looking at maiden success. It's run by Murdoch University, and I don't know what the results are yet, because I think it's wrapping up, where they've put maidens on a post-weaning plain nutrition that's low or high, and that might point to the answer for you. So generally speaking, I would expect an animal, if it's woody, really poorly grown and poorly developed, it's likely to be shorter, and that's probably going to be a permanent feature of its whole life. And it's less likely to be reproductive, but it might also have, well, it may not have a lower birth weight animal, so it may have more problems. So if it's poorly grown, I think it'll have challenges. So if it's really held back, I think you're facing a difficult animal to manage. That would be my view. Don't know if I answered all the questions there, Clint. Is there more?
No, that's really good. That's really good. Yeah, because there's a lot in it. Obviously, yeah, if you're buying, you got to know what you're buying, I guess. And just those animals that seem to have a really tough start it's just placing an extra bit of weight on them, I guess. It's just it's just an early setback they've got to get over, I guess. Yeah, and that makes it a big challenge, I think.
That's right. I think if they can reach something, I reckon, I'm guessing 80% of their mature weight, then they'll probably go on to be fine. And they'll be lighter, which will lower their DSEs, but they probably shouldn't have any progeny that are impacted because they still have their genetic base.
Yes. Yep. That's what we're finding here. Yep. Yeah.
Did you have another question, Clint?
I do, but I'll save that one for their nighttime shift. It's about ASBBs and all the rest of it.
All right, we'll go to one that's in the chat, and then if we've got time, we can come back to that. So Rodney asks, says condition scores would have mirrored body weights, I'm guessing. Any work on ewes pirating lambs and causing mismothering of her lambs and others?
Yeah. The headache of an animal. So yes, generally speaking, condition score will mirror live weight. They are intrinsically related, but not unitary. So a 1 kilogram increase in live weight doesn't result in a similar unit scale increase in body condition score. You can have 2 animals at 60 kilos, and one can be condition score 2 and one can be condition score 3. Which is why condition score is really recommended to manage animals on, because it's a reflection of their nutritional need and a retrospective on their nutritional past relative to their maintenance requirement. So if you've got a lean animal, you can put it on a better plane in nutrition. So weaning in a Queensland environment, I would be looking for the lean animals to try and get them up, whereas the heavier conditioned animals are less likely to have been rearing, and you don't have to push them too hard. Whereas in the southern environment, non-rearing ewes are going to be pretty fat, and fat ewes at weaning need management because they're slightly elevated non-pregnancy rates. And if they do get pregnant, you might get a few more triplets out of them. So you want to manage animals on condition score, which is the recommendation the industry has advocated for a long time. So the question about pirating mothers, what a headache of an animal. It's very, very infrequent, but DNA testing will always have its own error anyway, by a couple of percent. But there's always some surprises in DNA when compared to things like mothering rounds or walkover weighing that places pedigree relationships together, or the Smart Shepherd technology, which will pair a ewe and a lamb together, or ewe and lambs. So there's some variations. There are ewes that steal. They usually probably do it just before they're about to give birth, so they can rear one stolen lamb successfully and dump their own singles or twins, or rear all of them. It really depends. But I don't think it's a big proportion of ewes. But they're hard to find. If you're weaning and drying, you're keeping those animals in the flock, unless you know who they are. So unless there was DNA, if genomic tests were extremely cheap, you'd find these animals probably. Plus extremely cheap walkover weighing or pedigree matching technology for fostering ewes. But otherwise, don't worry about it. 90-20, 90-10, not enough animals to be worried about, I don't think.
All right. Well, there's no other questions in the chat. So, Clint, if you'd like to ask your last one, go ahead.
Yeah, you probably touched on it there, but as someone who's paying $400 for first cross ewes, do you ever see a time that we can maybe do a deeper dive into the sort of those first cross ewes? Rather, we sort of know what we're getting on the ram side of things, but genomics testing, all that sort of stuff would have to become much cheaper, I would think. But just, I guess, finding more data. I guess that's what you're showing here with the live weight gains and recording all that data on EID, I guess. But just how do you, we've sort of got the ram side of things working well. Just wonder how much more we can get out of the ewe.
Yeah, I think RFID is going to help get a lot more out of the ewe base than what we've been able to achieve at the moment. If I start with a flock that has adequate weaning rates, where sufficient pressure can be placed on culling ewes that fail to rear without it costing the business too much, you can keep your reproduction rates pretty high because you cull those animals out straight away. It doesn't have to be terribly accurate. Some work by the DPI, New South Wales Agriculture, 20 or 30 years ago now, showed that if you were to cull your maidens for their first time to fail, you might cull easily 25% of them in a year, easily. But if you hold off and give them another chance, you might only be culling 6% in the next year or over time. And the difference between 25 and 6 is 19, of course, and that means there's 19% selection pressure that can be applied to other ewes for other traits. And so that's where EID will help us keep track of these animals. If they've failed to rear, you can hold them if you want, particularly the crossbred where you have an accelerated mating system, or if you're in 2 matings a year, spring and autumn type mating systems, you have that flexibility. But in an annual mating system, holding onto a crossbred ewe is expensive. And so the decision to sell really comes back to the price that you receive versus the price you pay for the replacement. Because the replacements, excuse me, are usually expensive and unproven.
Yeah, I think, just to comment, I think the missing link in all this puzzle is the Smart Shepherd collars, or the AWI tags that we're working on. I know Mark Ferguson's doing work with the facial recognition, but finding those twin-bearing ewes that are actually rearing twins or triplets every year and getting that repeatability is the missing link in all of this.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Alrighty, well, we might wrap it up there. I'm just conscious of time. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending, and thanks very much, Gordon, for the presentation today. You've got the QR code on your screen there, or I've put the feedback form link in the chat if you wouldn't mind filling that out for us. It really helps us. Yeah, for our final reporting as we wrap up this project, and yeah, and it helps us plan future events as well. So there are plenty of other findings that's come from this PDS. So if you'd like to hear more about it, Gordon will be presenting at the Leading Sheep Forum in October in Longreach. So feel free to come along to that. We also recently took some dung samples at the demonstration properties, and they've been analysed and will be presented on by Desiree Jackson, who will, do some analysis of those and share her thoughts on how to use that information to guide supplementation decisions. That will be run in September, so keep your eyes out for that. And finally, we'll have our last PDS event at the end of March next year, and Gordon will be attending in person for that field day. So if you'd like to come along to that one, it will be an event not to be missed. So stay across the Leading Sheep emails or the Leading Sheep website for updates on all of these events. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time.